One of the more esteemed guests that I've had on the channel is Professor John Ashton, who was the Regional Director of Healthcare in the northwest of England for the NHS for 13 years. Professor Ashton joined me to discuss his many concerns about the Lucy Letby case, which particularly focuses on systemic issues at the County Chester Hospital. But before he discussed some of these systemic problems, he explained to me how he'd initially become concerned about the conviction of Lucy Letby.
I don't subscribe to the bad apple theory. I think usually if an organization is functioning well, it will deal with the rogues and with the bad apples in its presence. What's really disturbing is if you get a group of underperforming or rogue professionals in the same place, and where you can get a kind of microculture of delinquency and of poor behavior, which puts the public at risk and risks the reputation of the organization itself.
Yeah, I think very fair comments. Um, so I want to ask you about Lucy's case because you've spoken prominently about this, and I know you've co-authored, been one of the co-authors of a document on this. So how did you first hear about it, and why? I mean, I think I can to some extent guess why you became concerned, but do you want to tell us the story of how you became interested in it?
Well, I'm a news junkie. I read newspapers every day. Sometimes I read several newspapers. I really get, I'm a compulsive keeping up to date and being aware of issues. And quite early on in the trial of Lucy Letby, I woke up and thought, this is just craziness. This sounds like a dysfunctional hospital. And this sounds as though, given what we're hearing in the court, that this is all circumstantial evidence which seems to have been mobilized and focused on this one young individual. So that was where my initial interest began, whenever that was, 2 or 3 years ago. And I got in touch with Felicity Lawrence at The Guardian and said to Felicity, are you following this? Are you aware of this? Are you interested in this? As a result of that conversation, Felicity started to take a forensic interest. And she and David Kahn have since written a number of really important articles about the whole thing. And they've proved that we still do have very good investigative journalists in this country, despite the often parlous state of the print media. So, that's where I got involved. And then, of course, I've been involved with others, with colleagues from my past when we had to take action. I mentioned over Morecambe Bay, but I was involved heavily with the Alderhay scandal. I'd had to suspend the breast screening service at Carlisle because some women had been told they hadn't got breast cancer when they had, because of the failure of doctors to keep up to date in the screening protocols and so on. And so I've had quite a broad experience of dealing with both systems disasters in the NHS, but also rogue doctors, where you've got doctors who are doing things that they never were trained to do, have strayed outside of their skill set, and so on. And I'm very much aware of the tendency of doctors. Again, I don't think they're different from any other professional group, really, but to close ranks and to mind their own when things go wrong. I mean, when I first became regional medical officer, it was expected of me that I would be the doctor's doctor, that I would look after the doctors, those who were in trouble, who had drink problems and that kind of thing. And of course, one has a duty of care to staff, and one always has tried to exercise that. But early on, I made it clear to senior medical colleagues that I could not be the doctor's doctor. I had to be the people's doctor, primarily protecting the well-being and the safety of the public, whilst being respectful of my colleagues. I mean, I've had a fantastic, enjoyable career in medicine. I've reached significant levels within the NHS, and I hold some of my closest friends within the NHS. But this goes to the heart of the difficult task that hospital doctors and senior doctors have if they're in management positions as well, that they need to have a distance from their colleagues that's dictated by the primary responsibility to the public, whilst balancing that with a duty of care to their colleagues.
Absolutely. So you've already touched upon to some extent your concerns about the Lucy Letby case. Would you like to explain why, what your view is on this today and how you feel about the conviction and the situation as a whole?
Well, it's all been well rehearsed, not least in your own contributions to this. I mean, and if we start from this perspective about the lining up, like in a Gruyere cheese, the holes or whatever, we have all these different things that come together. So here we had a hospital that had ambitions above its station. The Countess of Chester was an ordinary local hospital. It wasn't a teaching hospital. It was a hospital that we have many of them around the country. Some of them do a very good job. Others do less of a good job. Part of the problem is that in many ways, the most capable doctors finish up in the teaching hospitals and in the hospitals in the cities and so on. And it's often doctors who maybe have struggled, haven't been as strong at medical school and so on, finish up in some of the other hospitals. And there's a paradox that the hospitals that really perhaps need the most attention paid to standards and to improvement may not have the right kind of leadership to achieve that. But what happened in the Countess was that it was a political agenda in the early years of the 2000s to encourage them to become foundation hospital trusts, to grow their business, using that word inappropriately for healthcare, and to extend their range into things that they perhaps hadn't been doing before, which is what we saw at the Countess. The Countess was one of the first handful of hospitals in the country to tick all the boxes to become a foundation trust hospital. And initially there was some money available to help them with that. That money later dried up. And that money, when it dried up, of course, lay behind some of the cuts in the services that then took place after the first few years. So that you had this contradiction of a hospital that was beginning to take much higher risk babies, but had got rid of some of the more specialist nurses, didn't have the clinical strength in depth, didn't have proper neonatal specialist pediatricians, and was itself in some difficulties from the point of view of the fabric and the estate itself. And, that came into prominence during the trial, but wasn't really given much attention when we heard the stories about sewage leaking through the ceiling above the baby cots. So the approach of the hospital itself, and what you could see as being potentially a collusion between hospital managers and hospital clinicians to really claim to be able to do stuff above their own capabilities. And so that was I think for the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of the shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of the horse, the battle was lost, or for the want of a nail. And the nail, I think, was possibly the the political push to have foundation hospitals on the basis that if you had competition between hospitals, this would reduce the costs of running hospitals. They become more efficient, they become cheaper to run, and so on, something which has proved to be fallacious, as we now see around the country, particularly maternity and infant health clinical services in trouble in many places. So that was the first thing. The second thing was really then this whole issue about expert witnesses and the whole experience of having somebody who was supposed to be an expert witness but was well retired, wasn't even on the medical register at the time, certainly hadn't had the depth of experience in neonatal medicine that would have been required to give expert witness. And a problem that we have in this country, that there's no quality control over expert witnesses. And the fact that at the trial itself, the fact that the expert witness in question was said to have been totally unsuited to a previous case, but that was allowed to continue, was profoundly disturbing.
Later in the conversation, we moved on to discuss the systemic issues at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This was a particularly interesting aspect of the discussion because Professor Ashton has a lot of experience of previous crises and issues in the NHS, which of course in his position as regional director he had to deal with directly. So we went on to discuss some of the politics, financial issues and organisational problems that potentially caused issues at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
So again, another thing you touched upon that I wanted to discuss, again, this is not something that has been, I think, broadly discussed in relation to Lucy's case very often, is this foundation trust status and the way the NHS evolved in relation to that. So could you kind of explain the significance of that, please?
Well, I think I've really covered that, but we had this whole movement dating from the 1980s and 90s of trying to either privatize public sector organizations or make them much more like private sector organizations and encourage them to compete with each other rather than to cooperate. We saw it in the universities, getting the universities to collaborate with research proposals and research activity was very difficult 20 or 30 years ago. The emphasis has changed now, and the emphasis is more on getting the universities to work together in networks of a particular projects. And we've seen that particularly perhaps after the pandemic. But it's been the same. It was the same with schools, with local management of schools, when the local authority education departments were taken off the pitch, and where the regional health authorities, the regional hospital boards, as they originally were, and which had oversight, were taken off the pitch, and the hospitals were given autonomy to aspire as high as they felt like. And that's the weakness here, I believe, is that the Countess of Chester, not to put too fine a point of it, had aspirations beyond its capability and its capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, I never like to comment on this too much because I don't know 1% about it compared to you, but it's something that a lot of people have said who are, healthcare professionals. I mean, I often get comments related to this. So you weren't the first person to raise this, but I just didn't really feel qualified to comment. Obviously, I know that finance can always be a motivating factor for any system, particularly in the NHS where it can be a premium. But I didn't really know too much about it, but it's certainly interesting to hear about it.
On which I think you may wish to just capture is this whole issue about who runs a hospital. You know, in 1983, Sir Roy Griffiths, who was a director at Sainsbury's, the grocers, was brought in to do a review of the National Health Service because there was concern that the consultants, who since 1948, when the health service was set up, had in theory been there to provide clinical leadership, hadn't really been exercising that leadership, hadn't been managing change, hadn't been looking forward to see what was coming down the track and what needed to be done to be fit for the future and so on. Because what we had from 48 onwards till 83 was we had consultants who were very powerful, but who really often weren't interested in management. And we had administrators of hospitals who'd been brought in from other bureaucratic organizations, maybe ex-military, maybe ex-colonial service, to run organizations, but didn't have the background or the clinical expertise and didn't have the powers to really intervene where there was clinical service issues. So Sir Roy Griffiths famously said, if Florence Nightingale was walking around one of these hospitals today, she would be trying to find out who was in charge without much success, you know. I mean, Florence Nightingale was probably the first hospital manager of a kind who used statistics out in Crimea. She used to collect the statistics of deaths in the hospitals, and she used those statistics to guide changes to improve the safety and the hygiene standards and so on. If you go to Liverpool, to one of the original Nightingale wards that she brought the design back from Crimea, there were round wards with a central fireplace, and the beds were radiating from the central fireplace with the head of each bed by an open window, so that the patients got the fresh air treatment and that you reduced the spread of contagious disease among patients. That she based all that in bringing that design back from Crimea, something that the Belgians had pioneered actually, and that use of statistics to be used to manage change in clinical practice, none of that was happening. And so as a result of Sir Roy Griffiths' report, the Griffiths report, they brought in what was called general management, and all the hospital consultant, most of the general managers, the chief executives, whose status was greatly enhanced after 1983, you know, paid a lot more money, they went through the national training program and so on. But they were supposed to be empowered to make decisions and really to put them in a stronger position vis-a-vis the medical consultants. But that tension had continued to exist between who really ran it. Was it the doctors or was it the general managers? And so about 25 years ago, I think it was now, they introduced medical directors and clinical directors who were given, and this was really about trying to find doctors in hospitals and in other parts of the NHS who were interested and nurses who were interested in clinical management and clinical leadership. Now, I can remember when I was charged with finding 40 or so medical directors for all the hospitals in the Northwest, along with the chairman of the Regional Health Authority at the time, Alistair Breckenridge. And we struggled to find the numbers of people who we really thought had the aptitude and the ability to take on responsibilities for being medical directors and then clinical directors within each of the clinical specialty areas. And we embarked on a development program for those that were going to take on these responsibilities. But it's clear, and we see it from the Countess of Chester, that not all these people were up to the job. And the issue about the relationship between them and the consultants, and the extent to which the consultants from time to time are seen to be not corporate, slagging off the general management, and the general management not being able to take the clinicians with them on a journey of change, that we still haven't got it right. Because ideally what you need is people who understand the business, who've got some kind of clinical background, but who really, for whom management is second nature, and who can personally distinguish between respectful, collaborative behavior with their clinical colleagues and standing back and recognizing their primary duty is to the public. It's the distinction I drew at the very beginning of this about how I understood my role when I took on the regional job.
Professor Ashton features in my forthcoming book on the Lucy Letby case, but I must say as well that I feel I would like to tap into his expertise much more and write another book about Lucy's case in the future that would focus on broader aspects of healthcare, broader aspects of what went wrong, essentially. I don't know when that will happen, but I do think that there is a lot of unused material and so many things to discuss that would make a further title certainly viable. But for the time being, I was really grateful to Professor Ashton for appearing on this channel, and he made many pertinent remarks, and you can read more about his opinion on the Lucy Letby case in my book, Reasonable Doubt, examining the case of Lucy Letby, which is released on the 9th of July. Thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.